Let's start with this one. All right, can you see a Word document that says 4th century leader chart?
Yes.
Thank you.
Everyone's muted, but I can see it. So I think everyone else can too.
Okay, Alex. Okay, this is just something I did for my own convenience and sort of just to keep in line who was in charge of what area of the world at this time. And so we can see the major players for the Armenian church in the 4th century were particularly the Armenian kings, the Armenian patriarchs, known in this time as Hayrabed or Yebiskobos Abed or Kahanai Abed, the Iranian king of kings, the Roman emperors, the Bishop of Rome, and the Archbishop of Constantinople. So you can see King Dertat had a very long reign, as did Grigor Lusavoric. Shapur, Shah of Iran, had a very long reign, almost the entire century. And the number of people who served as Archbishop of Constantinople was changing, well, very often. And most of the people on this list carried over from the end of the 4th century into the 5th century, but we'll get into that more over the course of the lecture tonight as well as next week. Okay, one moment again. All right. Okay, so I have called the 4th century a formative century for the history of the church in Armenia. Now, you don't necessarily need me to say that, but there is very good reason for this. The Armenian Apostolic Orthodox Church, as pretty much as we know it, begins in this time, with its genesis impacted by the lives of several important and powerful individuals, many of whom I just alluded to in that previous list. It is the beginning of the Armenian Church's tradition, its formal history, its liturgical life, its hierarchy, its establishment. And when I say establishment, I mean that in a very technical way. That is to say, it was the formal legal religion of Armenian civilization. And of course, this is the beginning of the integration of Armenia into the wider Christian world, and likewise, the Christian world in Armenia. So tonight's lesson will primarily follow the classical histories and trace the history of the church in Armenia through the life primarily of St. Gregory and his descendants. Interwoven through this family narrative will be the importance of that actually will be made clear later on, but interwoven through this family narrative will be other topics or issues. Now, as I've come to understand it, there are about 5 issues that I think stand out most clearly. First is the process of conversion. That is to say, it wasn't just St. Gregory who came along and poof, Armenia was automatically Christian. It was a process that took many decades, if not a century or two, for Christianity to become firmly embedded in Armenian society. It wasn't just one-stop shopping. It took many generations, and it was long and arduous. But of course, the 4th century encompasses the very beginning stages of that process. Also, I'd like to talk about the initial organization of the Armenian church's hierarchy. As Christianity was a new faith for Armenia, as it was everywhere in the world at some point, the church hierarchy had to develop in one form or another, and it didn't just come out of air like manna from heaven. And the hierarchy in Armenia developed in a different way than it did in Rome or in Persia. And Armenia had a unique model to follow, as will be seen. Oh, excuse me for just a minute. There we are. Additionally, I will be looking at the relation of the Armenian church to various states, both the Armenian state, the Armenian monarchy, as well as the foreign powers of the time, principally the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. No religious body in antiquity can be said to have been separated from state power, as we might understand in the 21st century. So each institution was effectively bound up with the operation of the other. So the Armenian Church had to reckon with its own king and the Nakharars of Armenia, but also with with other state powers, the Roman military, the Roman emperor, the Persian emperor, so on and so forth. There will be noted the influences on Armenian Christianity, both from Armenia itself, as well as influences from outside of Armenia. Effectively, the 4th century gives great credit to the statement that Armenian Christianity is effectively a crossbreed or a mutt, that it being at a crossroads of Asia and Europe and the battleground of competing empires, was naturally exposed to various influences. But to its credit, the Armenian Church simply took these in, as will be seen. And there's one other element that I would like to take note of, which is the connections between ethnicities. Christianity, especially in this time, was a truly multi-ethnic faith, and in which there was very literally neither Jew nor Greek, as Paul tells us. And for Armenia, this is extremely crucial. So just to get a quick grasp on the entirety of the 4th century, I have here a very short timeline of particularly significant events. So 301 is the traditional date of the adoption of Christianity by Armenia under the auspices of King Dertad and his government, as well as the beginning of the process of Gregory's evangelization. 303 is the traditional date of the completion of the first church on the site of Holy Ecumenical. 313, we all know, is the date of the Edict of Milan, issued by Emperor Constantine and the co-emperor Licinius, which established tolerance for Christianity in the Roman Empire, but did not yet make it legal. Of course, prior to this, 2 years prior to this, was the Edict of Serdica, issued by the Emperor Galerius, which ended the persecutions begun by Emperor Diocletian. Then, of course, we have the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, called by Emperor Constantine, attended by the second Catholicos, or Hydrabed of Armenia, who was also the second son of Gregory, Aristages. 335, this is a very interesting event in the history of the fourth century, which does bear directly on the life of the Armenian Church. The celebration in Jerusalem of the dedication of particular churches in Jerusalem built and sponsored by Constantine, in which Armenians were present. And during the same time, there is a letter from the Bishop of Jerusalem to the third Catholicos, the older son and second successor of Gregory, Saint Vertanes. And we'll get into that later. 354 was an indigenous Armenian Church Council convened by Saint Nerses I, who I believe was the great grandson of Gregory. And of course, we have the Edict of Thessalonica, issued by Emperor Theodosius I, which officially made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. The Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 381, called by Theodosius as well. A peace treaty settled between Rome and Iran, in which Armenia was formally divided and lost its official independence, and the latter portion of the 4th century, in which Theodosius persecutes pagans in the Roman Empire. So a very, very active century, as we'll see. So, of course, the best place to begin the story of the 4th century is the conversion story of King Dertad and Saint Catholicos Gregory I, the Enlightener. The conversion story is covered in all of the major early sources, namely the Agathangelos and his History of the Armenians, Movses Khorenatsi's History of the Armenians, who mentions Agathangelos as a source, the epic histories formerly attributed to a certain Faustus or Busant, but now we know it's just the epic histories, and also the History of the Armenians by Ghazar Parpetsi. I won't go into great detail as to the manuscript lineage, interconnections, and so forth of these various texts. But we can say for certain that these texts, even though they were written sometime after the events about which they describe, are our best records of this period in Armenian history. There's a particular book, actually, written by the late, great Dr. Robert Thompson, The Lives of St. Gregory, the Armenian, Greek, Arabic, and Syriac versions of the history attributed to Agathangelos. Effectively, the story of Gregory and the conversion of Armenia was so popular that for many, many years, for many generations, there were various versions of it in at least these four languages. So it's a very big deal and not limited just to Armenia. Many people in the Christian East knew of this story. So I'll be sticking to the story and timeline as presented in Agathangelos. I won't go into too many of the details where they might diverge. So I believe Dr. Irvin ended last week's lesson with the mission of Anak. This would be Gregory's father. He was sent as a member of the Parthian Suren Pahlavuni noble family by the Sasanian king of kings to assassinate the remaining Arshakuni Roman client king in Armenia, who at this time was Khosrov II, on the dubious promise that his family would be spared. And this is precisely what happened. After ingratiating himself with Khosrov in the Armenian royal court, he killed his royal relative, and then Anak's family was killed by the Armenian high aristocrats, all except for one son, who of course was Gregory. Gregory was whisked away to the city of Caesarea in Cappadocia, which is in the middle of Asia Minor, and he was raised as a Christian here. And two of Khosrov's children were also whisked away from danger. His son Dertad, who would eventually become the future king, and his daughter, Dertad's sister, Khosrovituch. According to the scholar Nina Garsoyan, this is actually a very popular and ancient trope in Iranian epics, that the true heir of power, grace, so on and so forth, is whisked away from danger and returns to claim his rightful inheritance, which is precisely what happens not only for the king, but for Gregory as well. And Dertad was taken to the west, presumably to Rome, and raised as a pagan. Now, according to Agathangelos, Dertad was installed as the Roman client king of Armenia, likely under the reign of Diocletian, and this was out of gratitude for helping Diocletian out of a military quarrel, in which I don't need to go into all the details, but suffice it to say, Dertad was noted for his great physical prowess. He was noted as being very strong, and he was able to overcome a challenge. So he became a Roman client king of Parthian descent, much to the chagrin of the Sasanian king of kings. When Gregory came of age, he went to work in the court of Dertad for many years, partially as a means to make up for his father's murderous actions so many years prior. At some point during his career, in which he served the king faithfully, he was subjected to torture for not honoring the ancestral gods, and specifically the goddess Anahit. And Agathangelos gets into a very gory and explicit cataloging of the various tortures to which Gregory was put through. But this is a PC presentation, so excuse me, not PC, PG presentation. It's family friendly, so I won't get into that. Suffice it to say, it was gruesome. During this time, it was revealed to Dertad that Gregory was the son of Anak, at which point Gregory was banished to death by oblivion in the dungeon of Khor-Virab. Now, let me see, Khor-Virab. Oh shoot! All right, I'll have that fixed for next time. This is the picture of descending down into the dungeon. It's very, very far, but I don't think anyone would want to actively go there unless you're going to pray. Anyway, during this imprisonment, which bears great resemblance to the story of Daniel in the Bible, we are told that an elderly woman was instructed to throw bread into the dungeon for 13 years, which of course allowed Gregory to live. It was also during this time of Gregory's imprisonment that a group of Roman nuns fled from Rome after being pursued by Diocletian as potential brides. And of course, as nuns, they would never submit to a pagan, or even if he was a Christian, they'd never submit as being wives. And of these, of course, were Hrypsime, her abbess, Gaiane, and all of their companions, including the nun Nune, whose importance will be revealed probably toward the end. And actually has little to do specifically with Armenian. It has more to do with our Christian neighbors to the north. Of course, they found their way to Armenia. Now, in Agathangelos, the story of Hrypsime and her companions is found in sections 137 to 212, and I won't read through all of that. Effectively, Dertad, upon seeing Hrypsime, desired her greatly and, of course, made advances toward her, regardless of the fact, of course, that he was married already to Queen Ashtishat. And we learned from the story that Hrypsime rebuffs him, strengthened by faith and encouraged by Gaiane. And Agathangelos makes a very specific point of emphasizing that this great king, who owed his crown to Rome specifically for his physical prowess, was bested by a young, albeit very tall woman. And a young nun was able to best one of the strongest kings in the land. Of course, this did not go over well, and Dertad ordered the torture, mutilation, and execution of all the nuns. Except, however, Nune was one of the few who was able to survive. And then we learn, after mourning for himself effectively, Dertad was basically said that the beautiful Hrypsime was gone. Not the fact that he killed her, but that the fact that a beautiful woman was dead. After this, about 6 weeks or so, he prepares to go on a royal hunt, which again is a standard trope of Iranian epic and legend. This is when the king this is the moment when the king is able to display his prowess, his power, his glory, and so on and so forth. It's just before this, however, that he is struck by a demon as a punishment from the Lord, and effectively is struck with lycanthropy. He turns into a wereboar. And that term I got from an article written by Dr. Chris Sheckley on the Vemkar website. And of course, Dertad could not be healed by any physician in the kingdom. Now, thankfully, we had not one, but two children of Khosrov survive. Princess Khosrovitucht had a vision of Gregory in Khorvirab as being the only one who could save her brother. So 13 years after Gregory was in prison, she sent officials to fetch Gregory from the pit, and he was found miraculously to be alive. Supported by faith, prayer to God, and of course by the little old lady's bread. He was removed from the pit, cleaned, and brought to the king. And after this, he prayed to God for healing. And in this way, the process of Dertad's personal conversion, as well as the conversion of the entire Armenian court, began in earnest. However, and this is actually something that I myself was rather was struck by upon learning this fully. Dertad was not actually fully healed just because Gregory prayed over him. This was the initial this was the initial stage of the conversion, but Dertad's healing and his ultimate coming to Christ was not in this one episode. This took place over the course of a majority of the book, in fact. So what we have for King Dertad is also a long and involved process, namely the appeal to repentance, Gregory's prayer for healing, another call to repentance by the larger Armenian royal court, the teaching of Saint Gregory, which was published outside of the history of Agathangelos in a separate book, I think 2001, which actually constitutes the majority of the Agathangelos history. Sections 259 to 715, almost 500 units of writing dedicated just to this one teaching. And then after the teaching, Gregory calls Dertad and the court to care for the remains of Hrypsime and the other nuns. and of course, the construction of martyr churches for them specifically. And it was after all of this, in section 773, that Dirtad was finally healed. So it wasn't just one event or a couple of events, it was a whole long process that, according to Agathangelos, took, I think, it was either 6 months or 60 something days, a very long time, regardless of the exact length. And actually, from my own understanding, this seemed to be almost a theological allegory, that illumination, conversion, or becoming a Christian involves a process, including repentance, prayer, correct teaching, and good devotional works, sort of manifesting one's faith in an actionable way. Dirtad and Gregory, with the consultation of the nobles after Dirtad's conversion, decide to do away with all the pagan shrines and the old religious establishment. And it is Gregory who was entrusted to do this. I'd like to read just a short selection from the history directly. This would be section 777 and 78. I won't read all of it, but a little bit I think is warranted. Speaking of Gregory, he then took counsel with the king and the nobles, the princes and the army concerning a common peace. They agreed to overthrow, destroy, and extirpate the scandals. This, of course, being the pagan shrines and temples. To suppress them entirely, lest there be henceforth an obstacle to anyone or a stumbling block, preventing him from attaining celestial freedom, and that all might be strengthened and attain perfect blessing, the goal indicated by Blessed Paul. Quote, that in unity we may attain the measure of the stature of Christ, end quote, whose freedom is in heaven, whence we look for the great Savior, God, and our boast is in the cross, and our joy in the glory of God. And of course, in the next section, we reread, then straightway the king by sovereign edict, with the agreement of all, entrusted blessed Gregory with the task of obliterating and extirpating the former ancestral deities of his forefathers, falsely called gods. So what we have here is Gregory being entrusted and officially deputized by the king in consultation with all the major nobility, army, and the people responsible for the societal well-being of Armenia, entrusting Gregory with this specific task, including the use of the army to do so. And is also, what's also very interesting about this is that Gregory is not yet a clergyman. He's still a member of the laity, but he's still acting on behalf of the church, or the church, but not necessarily in its institutional form yet. So the tasks are to destroy the pagan temples and to alienate properties to the church, and of course, convert or do away with the pagan clergy. Now, it seems to me that part of this council or gathering of nobles, I think it betrays it's a tacit acknowledgement by Agathangelos of the presence of Christians in Armenia before Gregory's time. Because the Council of Nobles was an extremely important institution for Armenia. It was essentially the major principle upon which government worked, that the individual princes of their individual realms, as well as the monarchy, the central crown, governed together. So whatever what the king wanted to do, he had to have the nobles' consent and input. And if the council so decided, in pursuit of the king's newly converted will, to destroy the old pagan temples and replace the old establishment with a new one, then it seems to me, it stands to reason, that some of the nobles must have been Christian. Otherwise, why would they have agreed to the king's decision to destroy the old pagan temples? Anyway. And of course, it's probably a little strange to think of using the army to enforce the church, the establishment of the church, and get rid of the old pagan temples. But we're also talking about the 4th century. Violence is par for the course with these sorts of actions. Not in Armenia, in Rome, anywhere. Anyway, so okay. At this point, I'd like to break for a brief parenthesis. No. Well, we have here the we have here, of course, Saint Ripsime. If you can look, if you notice at the bottom, she's standing on King Dirt on King Dirtod at the very bottom, if you can see. Poor King Dirtod. Well, all the better though for all of us. And of course, this wasn't the original Ripsime church, but this is one of the one that has lasted. This actually wasn't built too long after the original church, about 3 centuries or so. And this, of course, Saint Kayaian, eh? Oh, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, now concerning the hierarchy of the Armenian church, there was something that I've often heard, but I was not quite sure of until, well, again, until I learned of it myself. Namely, I'm not, maybe other people have heard this, but I was always told that the bishops, the Armenian clergy, were members of the noble houses. And I thought, originally, I thought, okay, that makes sense, but why is that particularly significant? Weren't the Europeans, didn't members of the noble houses enter the clergy as well? Well, yes, but not in the way that they did in Armenia. Now, as I said before, the principle of government in ancient Armenia, I'm mixing terms a little bit here, but I think it's useful, was effectively federalism. That is to say, real sovereign power was held by the Nakharars. That is to say, the highest of all the nobility in ancient Armenian society. They owned their estates, which were the provinces themselves. The king also was a Nakharar, the first among Nakharars, but his immediate jurisdiction was little more than the royal province. And anything that the king wanted to do among the other provinces, he had to do with the consent of his brother Nakharars, so to speak. So religious houses were also attached to the provinces. Furthermore, another principle of government in Armenia, inherited from the Parthian period in Iran, was that families owned government powers. So if a noble family had control of a province, then it belonged to that family and it could not be taken away from them. It belonged to the family, past, present, and future. For example, the Mamagonian family, in addition to being the Nakharars of a particular group of provinces, and that was their birthright. They could not be taken away from those provinces. Those provinces couldn't be taken away from them. But the Mamagonians also inherited the office of commander-in-chief of the army of Armenia. So likewise, the church hierarchy was attached to the noble houses. And this is why it's important that members of the Nakharar house of the nobility were the clergy. They inherited the office of bishop of the province through their family, and the church came to be, for lack of a better word, feudalized in that way. So I have a quote here from the scholar Nicholas Adons. The nationalization of the church in Armenia meant its Nakhararization or feudalization. Since the political regime in Armenia was feudal in character and the power was divided among many princely houses, ecclesiastical authority likewise had to assimilate itself to the existing society and adopt the forms which were ready at hand. And of course, that was the nature of hereditary offices. So, for instance, if we had that system here in the United States, we would not be electing our bishops. Rather, Bishop Daniel, the Findikian family, would own the right to raise its members to become the primate of the Eastern Diocese, just as an example. Of course, that's not what we do nowadays, but that was the model that was active in this time. And so, St. Gregory was effectively the hereditary bishop of the royal province of Armenia and was the bishop of the royal court. And this, of course, was completely against the Western Greco-Roman style of tradition of electing magistrates and subsequently of electing bishops. Yeah. Now, another interesting point about the hierarchy in Armenia. Now, I mentioned earlier that part of St. Gregory's mission initially was to convert or possibly kill, if necessary, the pagan clergy. But Agathangelos actually makes a very interesting and, I must say, comforting addition. So now let me see. I believe it's section, where is it? 781. Okay. He's talking about, Agathangelos in this section is talking about a temple that's been razed. But the people who had come raised the remaining foundations and distributed the accumulated treasures to the poor, the suffering, and the needy. And they devoted to the church's service the temple's property and servants with the pagan priests and their lands and territories. So effectively, in Agathangelos, and Moses and Khoronatsi agrees with this, or he corroborates. He says the same thing. It's not just the temple properties. I should go back for a second. The religious establishment in Armenia, the ancient pagan establishment, were also hereditary offices. So a pagan temple wasn't just the property of the temple building itself, but it was also all the lands and farms or what have you that supported the temple. These were estates in the same way that nobles had their own estates. And so these properties were alienated to the church. That is to say, they were taken away from the temple and brought to the church. But the proprietor, the actual owner of these properties, did not always change hands. So, for example, according to Moses Khoronatsi, among the children of Vahagan, which is to say the Vahevuni priestly family, found some men who of their own will who asked for the ministry of the churches and to whom was entrusted the priesthood. So the priestly family of the temple in the royal district of Armenia, this is the Vahavunis, they were in charge of the cult of Vahagan, which was the pagan god that was patronized by the Armenian kings. They themselves became part of their family became Christian priests. So even though the temple properties were given to the church now, the people who actually owned the properties and made use of them, those were the same. So the property was not always taken away, which it's fascinating, really. You already have a class of clergy. You just Gregory just co-opted them into the new faith, which is brilliant. And so a little bit further on in Agathangelos, and this is later on in the history, from every place within the borders of Armenia and from the lands and provinces of his realm, King Dertad commanded many youths to be introduced to the art of writing and faithful teachers to be put in charge. Especially the families of the impure pagan priests and their children were brought together in suitable places, and an adequate stipend paid them. Suddenly, they became acquainted with the prophets, familiar with the apostles, heirs to the gospel, and fully informed about all the traditions of God. And further on, in the epic histories, the Byzantaran Badmutyung, we have, again, the same thing. I have a quotation here, not from the Byzantaran, but from a scholar writing about it. King Dertad had given vast lands to the Armenian church upon his conversion, and most of these lands would have appeared to have been simply those transferred to the church from earlier pagan religious establishments, just as I said. And others were lands taken from princely houses which had become extinct. Now, again, this is in line with what was said earlier, that the estates of the nobility could not be taken away from them. So if the king did give them away, the family was just no longer in existence for whatever reason. And actually, later on in the century, Chief Bishop Nerses, this is Nerses the First, the Great, his domains, the domains of the Catholicos, were said to have been composed of 15 different districts. And this is in the Byzantaran. So that's quite a lot of property to be used at the church's disposal to do its work and to do its missionizing. Okay, Let me see. Mhm. Okay. So, all right. So we've touched upon this, that the Council of the Realm. This was the gathering of Armenian nobles with the king to decide on issues of policy. This it was a pre-Christian um, Iranian pattern of governance, which the Armenians just took for themselves. No big deal. Okay. Excuse me. Um, oh, very interesting. Another interesting part in the conversion story. After this work was done, at some point, Dertad wanted Gregory to become the bishop of the Armenian court and of Armenia proper. Let me see if I can find the specific. Here we are. Section 792. The king held a council with them all, urging them to become heirs to good works. Come, he said, let us hurry to make as our pastor Gregory, this guide of our lives given us by God, so that he can illuminate us with baptism and as a teacher of the law, renew us by the sacrament of God our Creator. And in the Armenian, it actually does call, it puts into, Derta does actually use the word hoviv. So it wasn't just the translator, it was actually the word hoviv, the pastor. But of course, Gregory, being a good Christian leader, balked at the idea and said, no, I'm too humble, I cannot do it. However, again, emphasizing the real degree of unity between church and state in this time, we learn that right in the next section, that Dertad, the king, had a vision from God in which God said, you will have Gregory ordained to the priesthood, no questions asked. And then the king summoned Gregory and told him the vision, to which Gregory then agreed. And again, it wasn't just Dertad sending his own royal retinue for Gregory. It was Dertad, the royal carriage, as well as accompanying nobles. So again, the Nakharars are very important. You can't just ignore them. They are the government of Armenia in tandem with the king. So not only was the church bound up with the royal establishment, but essentially the entire structure of government in Armenia at this time. And of course, after his consecration in Caesarea in Cappadocia, he returns as bishop and continues his missionizing work. Now, at this point, the history of Agathangelos shares many details, and likely picked up many details from another work describing the life of Mesrop Mashtots. But of course, this is not uncommon. This is just how ancient texts were written. You borrow things that make the point that you're trying to make. But I'll get into that for the 5th century. Now, as should be very clear at this point, Agathangelos, the focus of his work is very Western oriented. We have the emphasis on Diocletian and Constantine, who makes an appearance toward the end. You have Roman nuns being responsible for the conversion of Armenia. There's the ordination of Gregory in Cappadocia, and so on and so forth. And of course, when Gregory is old and retires from the chief episcopate, it is entrusted to his second son and lifelong celibate Aristages, who we know for a fact was an attendant and signatory of the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 325. So Agathangelos is a very, very Western-oriented source. Of course, this is understandable, but it's only part of the tradition. Agathangelos also reports that when canons from Nicaea were brought back to Armenia, Gregory, of his own authority, made additions to these illuminating canons, making still more righteous his own see of Armenia. And this stuck out in my mind very peculiarly. How could a bishop on his own authority change a council's canons? Well, he could. It was his see. They were the canons that he needed to adopt, and so he did, staying faithful to the tradition, but adapting it to the needs of his flock. So obviously this takes us to the 320s, the early 330s. So as we can see, this whole process was itself part of a larger process. The conversion of Armenia begins with Gregory, but by no way ends with Gregory. Okay. Okay. Continuing on. Gregory, as we know, had two sons, an older son Vertanes and a younger son Aristages. As we mentioned, the latter son was the first successor to the patriarchate. He was a celibate all his life. Of course, Vertanes was a layman most of his life, but then when Aristages died, he naturally succeeded his brother and his father, again, operating on the principle of hereditary offices. And of course, he was an older man by this time and prayed to God for a son to succeed him on the Catholical throne, again, to perpetuate the hereditary office of the Catholicosate. And as in another biblical narrative, like with Sarah and Isaac, Vertanes' wife was able to bear children. They were two sons. They were twin sons and twin grandsons to Gregory Lusavoric. The first was Grigorios, named after Gregory, and the second son was Husig. And what's also interesting about Vertanes is that, again, Christianity was a new faith, even if it had been in Armenia for some time. But at one point, Vertanes had rebuked the queen of Armenia. This would have been Dertad's daughter-in-law and son of the current king Khosrow III. Vertanes rebuked her for, according to according to the epic histories, for secret adultery and dissolute ways. And so she conspired she conspired with pagan practitioners and pagan priests who were still lingering around to try to kill Vertanes. Of course it didn't work, but it still speaks to the fraught nature of the relation between king and Catholicos at this very early stage. Everything wasn't set in stone yet. During Vertanes' life, the bishop Agbianos, whose family was the hereditary bishop of the province of Manaskert, which is today, which is in northwest of Lake Van in the present Mush province of Turkey. Agatangelos was sent by King Khosrow III and Vertanes on a peace mission between feuding Anacharars. So just some details in the life of Vertanes. Additionally, there was a conflict between Iran and Armenia, probably just the Iranians trying to assert themselves in the region, in which Armenia defended itself, but with heavy losses. And Vertanes, we learn, gave a battlefield consolation and sort of a hishadag for those who died, and in which he makes a comparison to the Maccabees in the scriptures. And after which, of course, Khosrow and Vertanes both passed away. Now, I make a reference to this specific episode because it will be extremely pertinent to the history of the 5th century. Okay, now, during this time, during Vertanes' reign, just before we move on a little bit, here, I've brought this slide up a couple of times, but now we can finally get to it properly. What you see here, as noted by the caption at the very bottom where it says 25, this was the original plan of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The current church that's there now dates from the Crusader period, from the 1000s, 1100s. This church complex was built by Constantine, in the early 330s. And of course, the dedication ceremony to this and other churches in the city was the Encania. Now, of course, in many colleges, in America especially, the Ensania celebration is when students are recognized for particular outstanding achievements, are given awards, and so on and so forth. This is where that comes from. And during this celebration, we learn that the Bishop of Jerusalem sent a letter of response to Catholicos Vertanes asking about how to properly perform baptism and Eucharist. Now, Dr. Abraham Terian has written a whole study about this letter. He's done a translation. He's talked about references of parts of excerpts of the letter and other sources. Did a whole introduction on the authenticity, the authorship, the dating, and so on and so forth. What is so fascinating about this letter is that we have the Catholicos of Armenia, the third Catholicos of Armenia, and son of the very first one, the illuminator himself, the enlightener of Armenia, appealing to Jerusalem as an authoritative source on liturgical life. And of course, consequently, on the scriptural exegesis that comes with that. So this is just absolutely fascinating that the Armenian Church, from such an early part of its period, drew inspiration and authority on its own practices from Jerusalem. So not only were they were present at this celebration in 335, because we know that Vertanes sent a delegation of priests to Jerusalem. We have the letter, and of course, the famous diary of the nun Egeria mentions that there are many priests from across the Christian world. And of course, according to the way she reports on the liturgical celebrations in Jerusalem, we know for a fact that the Armenian lectionary, the catalog of readings and liturgical performances, is the one upon which the Armenian lectionary is based. So from this very early period, the liturgical life is definitively and consciously shaped by the way Jerusalem does liturgy, which is just fascinating. Excuse me. Moving sort of to the side for a minute to talk about Gregorios, the older son of Vertanes and the older brother of the fourth Catholicos of Armenia, Husig. Gregorios was sent as the chief bishop of what's variously referred to as Agiwank or Albania, or Caucasian Albania or Caucasian Iberia, which is roughly where Azerbaijan is now. Not to be too topical. But of course, at this time, it wasn't Azerbaijanis, it wasn't Turks, it wasn't Tatars, it wasn't anything. It was a people known as the Alans or the Agiwanks. They no longer exist, but in this region of the world were another Caucasian people over whom Gregorios was sent as chief bishop. He preached to the Alans and sought to, quote, reestablish the faith in the churches there. And while he was initially successful, he ran into trouble when he told the nomadic Alans not to loot or pillage or so on and so forth, which was effectively their main source of income, precisely because it was, quote, the devouring of what belongs to others, the deprivation of others, the envy of possessions of others are all odious to God. But of course, the king of the Alans believed this was a ploy from the Armenian king to try to get the Alans to stop pillaging the Armenian land, which is not exactly a bad thing, but regardless, religion and politics bound up almost inextricably in this time. So poor Gregorios was martyred. He was killed. And he was buried with his grandfather, Gregory Lusavoric. And King Khosrov, before he died, and with the support of Catholicos Vertanes, pushed back against the Alan king, and they were victorious. So it's just another, I think, interesting episode of the operation of church and state bound up together, just the way life was. There is also in the epic histories a very long chapter. It's really only one chapter, but a very long chapter on the bishop James of Nisibis, very much prominent in the Syriac world. He also attended and signed the Council of Nicaea, and in Armenian tradition, he's made a cousin of Saint Gregory. whether this is actually true or not, probably not. But the point of it in the literature is to signify a very deep, real, lasting connection between the Syriac Christian world and the Armenian Christian world. And he was a rough contemporary of Vertanes. Okay. Continuing on, Khosrov III was succeeded as king of Armenia by his son Tiran, and Husig was also brought to Caesarea to be ordained as the chief bishop. And again, like Gregory, he was escorted by the nobility and a royal carriage, and again, they met in council. So we have some patterns emerging already at this very early stage. Husig was married to the daughter of Tiran. So the king and the Catholicos families were already bound up very tightly. And Husig had two sons known as Pap and Atanagines, and neither of them, according to the sources, were worthy to become Catholicos. They didn't want it, and they did not live very Christian lives. And so actually after Husig had his sons, he and his wife did not have any other relationships, which, among other things, soured his relation with the king Tiran. At this time, we learn that the king, the Nakharars, and many other people in the realm, down to the peasantry, were not really behaving like Christians. Catholicos Husig chastised Tiran for this, but to no avail. It didn't do anything. But actually, at one point, Husig specifically forbade King Tiran from entering church buildings and until he repented. And he became so angry that he had Husig almost beaten nearly to death. And in fact, he did die actually a few days later. So in this time, we see essentially spiritual chaos. To quote, people were treating it as if it were some human religion. They did not receive it with understanding as it is fitting, with hope and faith, but only those who were to some degree acquainted with Greek or Syriac learning were able to achieve some partial inkling of it. As for those who were without skill in learning and who were the great mass of the people, the Nakharars as well as the peasantry, even had spiritual teachers sat night and day pouring the abundance of their teaching over their heads like a torrent of rain from the clouds. Not one of them could keep in mind a single thing of what he had heard. Not a word, not half a word, not a minimal record, not a trace. So even in the 330s, 340s, we get here an inkling of what's going on. It's a new faith, even though Dirtad and Gregory and their immediate descendants were dedicated, it still hadn't stuck quite yet. And as noted in this passage, Armenian was not the language used for church. I mean, it wasn't a written language yet. It was just the language that people spoke naturally. But the official languages that you would hear in church were Greek and Syriac, which, okay, that's where the Christian sources came from, but it's not going to do them very much if you wanted to have actual sticking power, if you actually wanted to stick in people's minds. So it seems to me that this is sort of a prelude of things to come. The main impetus, as described in another source, behind the invention of the Armenian alphabet later. They didn't know what it meant to be a Christian in this time because of an obstacle of communication to proper learning, relevancy, and being able to internalize Christian teaching personally. And just as a humorous notation in the epic histories, this worthless and senseless reign when Tiran was king was this time. Just completely writing him off as a useless yutz of a king. I thought that was funny. Excuse me. Just also as an aside, there's mention in the epic histories of a certain bishop of the quote Syrian race in the province of Daron. This is let me see if I can go back to the map. Here we are. Where is it? I can't see it on this map, but Taron was one of the patriarchal provinces. It should be around Lake Von, but I'm having trouble seeing it. Well, either way, what we learn here is that in the epic histories is that there was a certain bishop named Daniel who was a Syriac Christian who was prelate and presumably acting on behalf of Gregory the First. I mean, when he was appointed. He was apparently in charge of the shrine at Ashtishat. Now, I'm going to see if you can see my mouse, where the mouse is, it's pointing to a red circle, a vertical line, and two horizontal lines perpendicular. This right here is Ashtishat. And this location, not Vagar Shapat over here, current Echmiadzin, but was in Ashtishat proper, where the main center, the administrative center of the church would have been. It was here that the royal pagan shrine was located of Vahagan, and which Gregory displaced. So in this area, which was a hereditary, was inheritance of Gregory and the Catholicosate, was being overseen by a Syrian bishop. According to Nina Garsoyan, who translated the epic histories, this seems to be, to her, an attempt to link the received tradition of Agathangelos and the connection to the west and to the north, this part of the country, to the earlier type of Christianity that came in from the south, from Syria, from down in this region and beyond the map. Okay. So just to briefly recap one specific point, and actually I think I've been building up to this up until now. We have for Armenia, as I mentioned earlier, Armenian Christianity was not one monolithic thing. Again, like Armenian church hierarchy, it did not just drop from heaven like manna. It had to come from someplace. And in the case of Armenia, we have not one, not two, but three sources. We have Western Christianity from the West, from Cappadocia. So it wasn't exactly the type of Christianity associated with Constantinople, or at least not yet, but from Cappadocia, a specific region of the Roman and later Byzantine Empire. We have Southern Christianity from the Syriac world, which again is emphasized by this Syrian Bishop Daniel, by James of Nisibis, Ashtishat, and other details. And of course, we have Jerusalem-style Judaic Christianity, which would be, if you will, a southwestern influence, but independent of itself, not dependent on Western or Southern Syriac. And of course, we know this because the conversion story in Agathangelos was principally focused on the massacre of Roman nuns. And of course, in the epic histories, the focus is on Ashtishat and the connections to the Syrian church. Okay, so back to the main narrative. Husig's sons were not worthy to become the Catholicos. They weren't interested in, and they didn't live proper lives. However, Pop and his wife, who we learn was named Varastucht, were childless, and so that part of the royal line died out. Atanagines and his wife Bambishan had a son who would become Nerses the Great, and it was him who took over the see of St. Gregory after his grandfather and his father's passings. Now, again, as I've been mentioning several times, this was proper and in line with Armenian tradition. It had to be someone of Gregory's family because only Gregory had the right to inherit the chief episcopacy, which also served, of course, as the bishop for the royal court. But Nerses was not old enough yet, so there was at least hold on one moment. There was okay. According to this, there were two Catholicoses before Nerses, and this was just to excuse me. No, I'm sorry. Just one Catholicos who was not from Gregory's family at this time. This was just so that Gregory could, not Gregory, Nerses could come of age. And this was Paren. Now, Paren belonged to the family of Armianos, who again was the bishop of Manaskert. And according to the histories, he was something of a milquetoast leader, not that impressive. He led a good life personally, but, quote, was not bold enough to admonish anyone or rebuke anyone's error or transgression, and, end quote, and just submitted to whatever the king wanted to do. And he wasn't Catholicos for very long. Okay. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. I was mistaken. It was two Catholicoses between Husig and Nerses. The second one was Shahag or Sahag, also from the Arbianos Manaskert bishop line. But again, like Paren, milquetoast leader, not that effective. He was nice. He was a good Christian personally, but really couldn't command a presence. Anyway, so eventually King Tiran died, and his son, Arshak II, assumed the throne. And of course, Nerses came of age, and he was not originally a clergyman. He was educated in Caesarea, had a military career, and served as a very high royal official for King Arshak II, known as the Senecabed, which is effectively Chamberlain, Chief Secretary, so forth, and also was in charge of carrying the king's sword. He was the grandson of Saint Husig and the great-great-grandson of Saint Gregory, and his reign was from 353 to 373. Also in the life of Saint Nerses, about whom the epic histories devotes a great deal of attention, makes several connections to the life of Saint Basil of Caesarea, Saint Basil the Great. Now, of course, they were not contemporaries. They weren't quite contemporaries with each other. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the purpose of writing and making these sort of anachronistic connections was not necessarily to give precise details of historical truth, but to communicate something more, that there was something more that should be known and noted about these two individuals, that there are similarities between the way they conducted themselves and how they executed their responsibilities that is noteworthy. All right. Now, I mentioned several times that the nobles gathered in council with the king to make big decisions on state policy, on issues and so on and so forth. What I forgot to mention was that one of the occasions in which such a council would meet is during a banquet, a royal banquet. All the stops out, excess, everything. Tiaras, crowns, everyone with a drinking place, and so on and so forth. This is effectively Congress, and I dare say I'm sure Congress would be a lot more fun if they would sit down to a feast with lots of drinking. But that's neither here nor there. In the epic histories, we learn that when Arshak II assumed the throne, he had been involved in restorative work, the nature of which is not, I don't think, particularly pertinent to this narrative. Suffice it to say, rights were restored and the kingdom was brought to peace. And so, during a banquet in celebration of this, the nobles and the king together wanted to elect a new patriarch after Shahag's reign was over. And together, here we are. Not counting the mightiest Nahabeds and Danuders, these just being synonyms for Nakharar. Those who were only officials of 900 cushions came to the palace in time of feasting and were disposed on banqueting couches, in addition to authorized servants, end quote. And it was during this feast that Nerses was unanimously elected as Catholicos because he was from the family of St. Gregory. And just as the Arshakuni King Arshak was the rightful inheritor of the monarchy and so could restore the secular kingdom, likewise, Nerses, as being from the spiritual royal family, if I may so call it that, was the only one who could restore the spiritual kingdom of the church. And of course, he was reluctant, but in the history, it's so that Arshak ordered it, and it was so. He was stripped of his royal robes, well, not royal robes, but secular robes, given a black cassock, such as I am wearing now, and made the Catholicos. Actually, I believe he was also ordained in rapid succession from deacon to priest to bishop and then made Catholicos. So obviously they wouldn't have anybody else other than Nerses. And as reluctant as he was, feeling himself not to be worthy and so on and so forth, the very next year, he held a council in Ashtishat, in the administrative center of the Armenian church, right in this area. Now, unique about this council, unlike previous councils that we've talked about, the Ashtishat council was only for bishops and for clergy. It was strictly for work of the church. I mean, removed from any influence of the central state or the secular nobles. According to Khorenatsi, there were various activities that were accomplished with this council. There were some canon laws and regulations that were promulgated, but most specifically, there were some institutions that Nerses set up. Now, I want to read the section here. This is from Book 4, Chapter 4. The most suitable places to be set aside for the building of almshouses for the poor and to collect the sick, the lepers, the paralytics, and all those who suffered. Leper houses were designated for them, assistance and maintenance, as well as shelters for the poor. For this was the order of the great Chief Bishop Nerses, and likewise of the entire Holy Council, that these people should remain exclusively in their own lodgings and should not go out as miserable beggars. Indeed, they should not set foot outside their door, but everyone should owe them protection. And this is, according to the histories, Nerses speaking. For, he said, the order of the realm must not be destroyed, but it is proper that everyone without exception should bring assistance mercifully and piously or fearfully and supply their needs, end quote. So part of Nerses's work was, I guess we would call them social services now, but removed from the auspices of the state. It was totally on the shoulders, and it was the responsibility of the church to provide for the poor and the needy and the sick and the so on and so forth, but not to the disruption of society at large. Quite an amazing figure, I think. Additionally, Greek and Syriac schools were set up in Armenia under Nerses's reign, which this was a resolution to the earlier problem of the people at large not living according to Christian teaching, but as will be seen, this was not to be a permanent solution. But regardless, it was settled for now. Okay, now going back just a little bit, from 337 to 361, which is to say from before the time of Nerses to the middle of his reign as Catholicos, there were at least 2 wars between Rome and Iran. The first one lasting from 337 to 350, and the second from 359 to 361. The peace treaty of Nisibis in 363 ended the war of the Roman Emperor Julian, known as Julian the Apostate. It was the end of his war, and it overturned the peace treaty of Nisibis Nisibis of 299 that was favorable to the Romans. This second Nisibis peace treaty of 363 was signed by the Emperor Jovian, and it effectively renounced a great deal of Roman influence and the alliance with Armenia, and returned many lands to Iran under the King of Kings Shapur II, who, if you recall from the leader chart, was King of Kings from 309 to 379. Okay. Excuse me. After Nerses' reign, there were 3 other Catholicoses who were of relatively short reign. All of them, again, came from the hereditary bishop's family of the Manaskert province diocese. These were Shahag, another Shahag, from 373 to 377, Zaven of Manaskert from 377 to 381, and Aspurages of Manaskert from 381 to 387. And again, not much is really known about them, so not particularly eventful Catholicos. In 381 also was the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople. Now, I'm not sure if you recall, briefly, when I showed the leader chart at the very beginning, there was one Archbishop of Constantinople, Macedonius I, who was, actually, he was Archbishop once in 342 to 46. I guess he was deposed, and then he was restored from 351 to 360. And he, unfortunately, was responsible for the creation of a new heresy, which known as, I hope I get this right, pneumatomachianism. Though literally those who fight against the Spirit. He was charged with denying that the Holy Spirit was divine and one of the Trinity with the Father and Son. Also in this ecumenical council was a condemnation of Apollinarius, which denied that Jesus had a human soul. And of course, these were brought to Armenia. Excuse me. After the Catholicos Aspurages of Manaskert came Saint Sahag I the Great. He was appointed by King Khosrov IV, and his reign, just a little Catholicosal reign for over 50 years. He became Catholicos in 387 and was Catholicos until 439. So he will be our main bridge into the 5th century. A very long reign, a very interesting life, and great deal of work. Of course, it's, I don't know whether to call it funny, tragic, or just a turn of events, such as it was. The beginning of his reign in 387 began with a peace treaty, peace in name only for Armenia. The Peace of Al Aquilisene. This was a treaty brought about between Rome and Iran that formally ended the independence of the Kingdom of Armenia and divided it between both realms, in which Iran obtained about 80% of all of Armenia. And this was partially brought about, I think, according to the research, by the factionalism of the Nakharars themselves, as well as the result of yet another Roman-Iranian war that didn't have any clear winner. All righty. Let me see. Oh, before we conclude with the summary, I should mention, of course, the little nun Nune. I mentioned her, and I almost didn't bring her back again. She was the survivor of the massacre of nuns initiated by King Dertad back at the beginning of the 4th century. And she wound up finding her way. Let me see if I can get to the map, to the other map. Yeah. she wound up making her way to Iberia or Georgia in this region. I'm moving the mouse over the area. Effectively, she became the Saint Gregory the Enlightener for Georgia. So in the cases of both Armenia and Georgia, the presence of women cannot be denied, or it cannot be ignored. It was because of the Hypsimeans nuns that Armenia was converted. And it was because of one of those nuns who survived that massacre that brought Christianity to the Georgians. In addition, we have the family of Gregory himself, who was rightful heir of the episcopacy of Armenia. And this continued through the 4th century and into the 5th century. Not only that, his family was involved with the evangelization of Caucasian Albania. Again, I'm indicating with my mouse here in this region where present-day Iran is. Not Iran, present-day Azerbaijan. Of course, I'm sure for most of us, it would be a lot more helpful if the Christian Alans were in that region rather than the Azerbaijanis. But again, that's tangential. Additionally, the daughter of Dertad and the sister of Khosrov III, Saint Salome, married King Rev II of the Georgian royal dynasty and became intertwined with the Georgian royalty. So we have come to the end, I believe. So I'll just finish up with a couple of points of summation. One moment. Okay. So starting from the year 301, we have in the 4th century the very beginning of the initial processes and initial stages of full-out Christian conversion. This apart from the more grassroots conversion from the previous 2 centuries, as Dr. Irvin talked about the last couple of weeks. Property rights were maintained in many cases. The pagan clergy were often co-opted and were able to maintain their control of their properties just under the paradigm of a new faith. The nobility culture of Armenia was extremely influential in developing both the organization of the hierarchy of Armenia, as well as the conciliar mechanism, how things were done in council. You could only do it in corporate action together, not just one person unilaterally. That being said, though, as it was needed and carefully determined, Gregory and the Armenians at large were able and did take, well, for example, the canons of Nicaea and adapt them as needed for the Armenians. In this time was friction between the early pontiffs, the Catholicoses, with the Armenian kings, the Iranians, and the Romans. It was never just, it's never so simple. There's always wheels within wheels, always different connections being made and having to work themselves out. We have also a very high degree of multi-ethnic interaction and cooperation. The conversion of Armenia was achieved not by any blood Armenian, but principally by nuns from Rome, Parthian Iranian royal family. This is, of course, Dertad and the Arshakuni family. Yeah. And of course, we have the connection to the Georgians and the Albanians, the Alans. And of course, Armenian Christianity was influenced both by European and Semitic Christianity of 3 varieties: Judaic Christianity from Jerusalem, Syriac Christianity from the southern regions of Armenia and the south of Armenia, and Greek Christianity from Cappadocia. These are the main points, I think, of the 4th century. A lot of activity going on, a lot of newness, sort of figuring out how the church is to work, how it is to incorporate itself into Armenian society, what things need to be done, how, by whom. And so we have a lot of very early foundations, very prominent. And this process of conversion does not stop in the year 400 of 399. This will continue on into the next century, no question. And at this point, I believe we have come to the conclusion of this lesson. And so next week, we'll pick up with the 5th century, how these processes continued, the challenges faced by the Armenian church and by the Armenian state, as shall be seen, and how, well, I don't want to give too much away, so I think I'll end it there. We have more of the process to continue and new beginnings as well as endings, even at this early stage. Thank you very much.